The crystal champagne flute shattered against the marble floor of our penthouse apartment, the sound echoing through the silence that had fallen between us like a death knell. I stood there, my hand still raised from where Michael had struck me, the sting on my cheek nothing compared to the fire burning in my chest. 20 years of marriage, and this was how we were celebrating our anniversary. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The irony wasn't lost on me that just moments before, he had been toasting to our eternal love, his voice smooth as silk as he quoted our wedding vows about until death do us part. I touched my cheek gently, feeling the heat radiating from where his palm had connected with my skin. In 20 years, Michael had never laid a hand on me. Sure, we'd had our arguments, our disagreements about money, about his late nights at the office, about the way he sometimes treated the household staff like they were invisible. But violence? Never. Until tonight, until I had dared to question him about the charges on our credit card statement, the ones from that boutique hotel downtown where I knew he'd been taking his secretary. The champagne was still fizzing on the floor, mixing with the shards of crystal, creating a sparkling mess that somehow felt like a metaphor for our marriage. Beautiful on the surface, but ultimately broken, dangerous to touch. I bent down slowly, my evening gown a pool of midnight blue silk around me, and began picking up the larger pieces. My hands were steady, though inside I was trembling with a rage so pure it felt like it might consume me from within. "Sarah, I'm sorry," Michael said behind me, his voice taking on that practiced tone he used in court when he was trying to sway a jury. "I don't know what came over me. You caught me off guard with those accusations." I didn't turn around. I continued gathering the crystal shards, each piece catching the light from the chandelier above us, fracturing it into 1,000 tiny rainbows. How fitting that even broken things could create beauty, I thought. Maybe that was what I needed to remember about myself. "Accusation," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. "Is that what we're calling facts now, Michael?" I heard him sigh behind me, that heavy, put-upon sound he made when he thought I was being unreasonable. It was the same sigh he'd given me when I'd questioned why he needed to work late every Tuesday for the past 6 months. The same sigh when I'd asked about the perfume on his shirts that definitely wasn't mine. The same sigh that had become the soundtrack to the slow dissolution of our marriage. "Sarah, you're being dramatic." It was one slap. I apologized. "Can't we just move past this and enjoy our anniversary dinner?" I stood up slowly, the crystal pieces cupped in my palms like diamonds, and finally turned to face him. Michael stood there in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, his salt and pepper hair immaculately styled, his blue eyes that had once made me weak in the knees, now cold and calculating. He looked like the successful attorney he was, the man who had swept me off my feet when I was 25 and working as a paralegal at his law firm. Back then, I had thought I was Cinderella, and he was my Prince Charming. Now I realized I had been more like Rapunzel, locked away in a tower of his making, my hair grown long from waiting for someone who would never truly rescue me. "Move past this," I repeated, walking to the kitchen island where I carefully deposited the crystal shards. "Michael, you hit me on our anniversary. After I confronted you about cheating on me, and you think I should just move past it." His jaw tightened, and I saw a flash of the temper that had been growing more frequent over the past year. "I am not cheating on you, Sarah. Those charges you're so worked up about, they were for a client dinner. Rebecca was there to take notes. It's called business, Rebecca." Even her name felt like poison in the air between us. 23 years old, fresh out of college, with legs that went on for miles and a laugh that sounded like wind chime. She'd been working as Michael's secretary for 8 months now, and I'd watched my husband transform during that time. Suddenly he cared about his appearance again, started working out, bought new cologne. He'd become attentive to details that had never mattered to him before, like making sure his shirts were pressed just right, and his shoes polished to a mirror shine. "Business," I said, tasting the lie on my tongue. "Is that what we're calling it when you book the penthouse suite at the Ritz-Carlton for a client dinner? When you order champagne that costs more than most people make in a week? When you stay until 3 in the morning discussing contracts?" Michael's face flushed red, and for a moment I thought he might hit me again. Instead, he turned away, running his hands through his hair in a gesture I recognized as his tell when he was trying to buy time to construct a lie. "You've been spying on me," he said finally, his voice low and dangerous. "Going through my things, checking up on me like I'm some kind of criminal." "I'm your wife," I said, surprised by the strength in my own voice. "I have every right to know where our money is going, especially when it's going to hotels and jewelry stores and restaurants I've never been to." The jewelry store. That had been the real kicker when I'd gone through the credit card statements. Tiffany & Co. A purchase for $8,000 made just last week. I'd checked my jewelry box, looked through everything I owned, and found nothing new, which meant that $8,000 purchase was sitting in someone else's jewelry box. Someone with wind chime laughter and legs for days. Michael turned back to me, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Not anger, not frustration, but something colder, something that looked almost like hatred. "You want to know the truth, Sarah?" he said, his voice deadly quiet. "Fine, yes. I'm seeing Rebecca. Yes. I bought her a necklace. Yes. We spent our anniversary evening together before I came home to play the dutiful husband for you." The words hit me like physical blows, each one landing with devastating accuracy. But instead of the crushing pain I expected, I felt something else entirely: relief. After months of doubts, of questioning my own sanity, of wondering if I was just being paranoid, I finally had the truth. "How long?" I asked, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "6 months," he said, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice, like he was proud of himself for successfully deceiving me for so long. Since the office Christmas party, I remembered that night. I'd been home with the flu, unable to attend the firm's annual celebration. Michael had come home late, claiming the party had run longer than expected. He'd smelled like perfume and wine, and when I'd commented on it, he'd laughed and said one of the partners' wives had hugged him goodbye. I'd believed him because I wanted to believe him, because the alternative was too painful to consider. "I see," I said, walking to the window that overlooked the city. 23 floors below, Chicago sparkled like a jewel, all lights and movement, and life continuing on as if my world hadn't just imploded. "And what happens now, Michael? Do you want a divorce?" I heard him move behind me, his footsteps soft on the marble floor. "I don't know," he said, and for the first time tonight, he sounded uncertain. "I mean, divorce would be complicated. My career, the firm's reputation, the money. Of course, it always came back to money, with Mike. Not love, not our 20 years together, not the vows we'd made in front of God and our families, just the practical considerations of asset division and public perception." "The money," I repeated, still staring out at the city. "You mean my money? Don't you, Michael?" I felt him stiffen behind me, and I knew I'd hit a nerve. It was something we never talked about, the elephant in the room that had grown larger with each passing year. When I'd married Michael, I'd been a paralegal with a small savings account and big dreams. But 3 years into our marriage, my grandfather had died and left me his entire estate. Suddenly, I wasn't just Mrs. Michael Davis, attorney's wife. I was Sarah Harrison Davis, heiress to the Harrison textile fortune, $20 million. That's what my grandfather had left me, along with the textile company that had been in our family for 4 generations. I'd been 28 years old, and suddenly one of the wealthiest women in Chicago. Michael had been supportive, helpful even, suggesting I hire financial advisors, lawyers, accountants to help me manage my newfound wealth. What I hadn't realized at the time was that all of those professionals were his recommendations, his contacts, people who owed their loyalty to him rather than to me. Over the years, Michael had gradually taken control of my finance. It started small, him offering to handle our joint accounts while I focused on learning to run the textile company. Then he'd suggested consolidating our assets for tax purposes. Before I knew it, Michael had power of attorney over my accounts, was listed as a beneficiary on all my investments, and had somehow positioned himself as the person who controlled my inheritance. The textile company was still mine, technically, but Michael served as chairman of the board, a position he'd maneuvered himself into by convincing me that my lack of business experience made me vulnerable to takeover attempt. For 17 years, I'd trusted him completely, never questioning his decisions, never looking too closely at the papers he put in front of me to sign. Sarah, let's not bring money into this, Michael said carefully. This is about our marriage, our relation. I laughed, a sound that surprised me with its bitterness. Our relationship? Michael, you just told me you've been cheating on me for 6 months. You hit me when I confronted you about it. And now you're worried about money? I think our relationship is pretty much defined at this point. I turned away from the window to face him, and I saw something flicker across his features. Fear, maybe, or calculation. He was thinking about the prenup we'd signed, or rather the prenup we hadn't signed. Back when we'd gotten married, I'd been poor, and he'd been the one with prospect. A prenuptial agreement had seemed unnecessary, almost insulting. Now, with my inheritance in play, that decision was probably keeping him awake at night. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What do you want from me, Sarah? He asked, and I could hear him trying to regain control of the conversation. I made a mistake. I'm sorry. We can work through this, go to counseling, take a vacation, whatever you need, whatever I need. As if my needs had ever factored into any decision in our marriage. When I'd wanted children, Michael had convinced me to wait until his career was more established. When I'd wanted to travel, he'd been too busy with cases. When I'd wanted to be more involved in running my own company, he'd insisted I wasn't ready, that I needed more experience, more education, more time. What I need, I said slowly, is for you to pack a bag and leave. Michael's eyes widened in surprise. Sarah, you can't be serious. This is my home too. Actually, I said, feeling a strange sense of clarity washing over me. It's not. This penthouse is in my name, Michael, purchased with my inheritance, just like the house in Aspen, and the place in the Hamptons, and the yacht. All of it's mine. I saw the blood drain from his face as the reality of his situation began to sink in. For 17 years, he'd been living a lifestyle funded entirely by my money, enjoying luxuries he could never have afforded on his attorney's salary alone. The penthouse alone was worth $12 million, and the monthly maintenance fees were more than most people made in a year. You can't just throw me out, he said, his voice taking on a desperate edge. I have rights. We've been married for 20 years. You have the right to whatever the law says you're entitled to in a divorce, I replied calmly. But you don't have the right to stay in my home after you've admitted to cheating on me, and after you've put your hands on me. Michael moved closer to me, and I saw a flash of the man I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. The charming smile, the soft eyes, the gentle voice he used when he wanted something from me. Sarah, baby, please, let's not do anything rash. We've been together for 20 years. That has to count for something. I love you. I know I made a mistake, but I love you. I studied his face, looking for any sign of genuine remorse, any indication that his words were anything more than manipulation. But all I saw was calculation, a man trying to figure out how to minimize his losses, how to hold on to the lifestyle my money had provided. If you loved me, I said quietly, you wouldn't have been celebrating our anniversary with another woman. If you loved me, you wouldn't have hit me when I asked you about it. If you loved me, Michael, you would have loved me enough to be faithful. He opened his mouth to argue, but I held up my hand to stop him. I want you out of here tonight, I continued. You can take whatever personal belongings you need. We'll figure out the rest through lawyers. Sarah, you're making a huge mistake, Michael said, his mask finally slipping completely. You think you can just throw away 20 years of marriage over one little indiscretion? You think you're going to find someone else at your age? You're 45 years old, for Christ's sake. You're not exactly a catch anymore. The cruelty in his words should have hurt me, but instead, they just made me sad. Sad for the woman I'd been who would have believed him, who would have thought she was lucky to have any man at all, even one who cheated and lied and hit her. Maybe you're right, I said. Maybe I won't find anyone else, but I'd rather be alone than be with someone who thinks so little of me, that he believes I should accept being cheated on and abused. Michael stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him realizing that his usual tactics weren't working. The charm, the manipulation, the attempts to make me doubt myself. None of it was landing the way it usually did. "Fine," he said finally, his voice cold and flat. "I'll pack a bag, but Sarah, you're going to regret this. You have no idea how to survive without me. I've been handling everything for you for 20 years. The business, the investments, the properties. You don't even know what you own, let alone how to manage it." His words were meant to scare me, and a week ago, they might have worked. But something had shifted in me tonight, something fundamental and irreversible. Maybe it was the slap that had finally woken me up, or maybe it was the casual way he'd admitted to his affair, like my feelings were irrelevant. Either way, I wasn't the same woman who had been picking up broken crystal just 20 minutes ago. "You're right," I don't know how to manage everything, but I know how to learn, and I know how to hire people who work for me, not against me. Michael's face darkened at the implication, but he didn't argue. He turned and walked toward our bedroom, and I heard him opening drawers, tossing things into a suitcase with more force than necessary. I stayed in the living room, looking out at the city lights, and thinking about the woman I'd been when I'd walked into this penthouse tonight. She'd been nervous about confronting her husband about his affair, afraid of what the truth might mean for her life. She'd still been hoping on some level that there was an innocent explanation, that their marriage could be saved. That woman was gone now, replaced by someone I was just beginning to recognize. Someone who didn't accept lies or excuses, or casual violence. Someone who knew her worth wasn't determined by whether or not a man wanted her. Michael emerged from the bedroom 20 minutes later with a large suitcase and his laptop bag. He'd changed out of his tuxedo into jeans and a sweater, and he looked smaller somehow, less imposing than he had in his formal wear. "I'll be staying at the downtown Marriott for now," he said stiffly. "My lawyer will be in touch." "I'm sure he will," I replied. "Mine will be ready." He moved toward the door, then stopped and turned back to me. "Sarah, I really am sorry about hitting you. That was inexcusable, but everything else, the affair, the way our marriage has, that's not all on me. You've been distant for years, disconnected. I felt like I was married to a stranger." I considered his words, wondering if there was any truth in them, any responsibility I needed to accept for the failure of our marriage. But then I remembered all the times I'd tried to reconnect with him, all the romantic dinners I'd planned that he'd been too busy to attend, all the conversations I'd tried to start that he'd shut down because he was tired or stressed or just not interested. "Maybe I was distant," I said finally. "Maybe I did disconnect, but Michael, you never tried to bridge that gap. You just found someone else to connect with instead." He looked like he wanted to say something else, but instead, he just shook his head and walked out the door. I heard the elevator ding as it arrived, then the sound of the doors closing, carrying him away from the life we'd built together. I stood alone in the penthouse that suddenly felt enormous and empty, listening to the silence that filled the space where 20 years of marriage used to. The broken crystal was still scattered on the floor, and the champagne had left a sticky residue on the marble. I should clean it up, I thought. I should call someone to help me, or do it myself, or at least put on some music to fill the terrible quiet. Instead, I walked to the window and pressed my palm against the cool glass, looking down at the city spread out below me. Somewhere out there, Michael was probably calling Rebecca, telling her that his wife had found out, that they could stop hiding now. Maybe he was painting me as the crazy, jealous wife who couldn't accept that their marriage was over. Maybe he was already planning how to spin this to his advantage in the divorce proceedings. But for the first time in years, I wasn't worried about what Michael was thinking or planning or doing. I was thinking about myself, about the woman I'd lost somewhere along the way, and the woman I might become now that I was free to find her again. I pulled my phone out of my purse and scrolled through my contacts, until I found the number I was looking for. Angela Morrison, my college roommate, who had somehow managed to stay in touch despite my marriage's tendency to isolate me from my friends. Angela, who had never liked Michael, who had always seen something in him that I'd been too in love to notice. "Sarah." Angela's voice was thick with sleep when she answered. "It's almost midnight. Is everything okay?" "No," I said, and then I started laughing, because it was such an understatement that it was almost funny. "Everything is definitely not okay, but I think maybe it's going to be." "What happened?" Angela asked, and I could hear her sitting up in bed, fully awake now. "Michael hit me," I said, and the words felt strange in my mouth, like they belonged to someone else's story. And then he admitted he's been having an affair for 6 months, so I told him to leave. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Then Angela spoke, her voice deadly quiet. "He hit you?" "Just once," I said quickly, then immediately felt stupid for qualifying it, as if once made it somehow less serious. "Sarah, listen to me very carefully," Angela said. "There is no just once when it comes to domestic violence. Are you hurt? Are you safe? Do you need me to come over?" The concern in her voice almost broke me. When was the last time someone had asked if I was safe? When was the last time someone had cared enough to offer to drop everything and come to me? "I'm okay," I said. "He's gone. I made him leave. But Angela, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how to be divorced. I don't know how to live alone. I've been married for 20 years. "You know what you do know how to do," Angela said firmly. "You know how to run a multi-million-dollar company. You know how to make smart decisions. You know how to be strong, even when you don't feel like it. And you know how to call your friends when you need help." I felt tears burning my eyes for the first time all evening. Through the shock and anger and hurt, I'd managed to stay composed, but Angela's simple kindness was threatening to undo me completely. "I'm scared," I admitted. "What if he's right? What if I can't manage without him? What if I'm making a huge mistake?" "Sarah," Angela said gently, "the biggest mistake you could make right now would be staying with a man who thinks it's acceptable to hit you. Everything else can be figured out. You can hire accountants and lawyers and managers and advisors. You can learn whatever you need to learn, but you cannot stay with someone who hurts you." I knew she was right. In my head, I knew that leaving Michael was the only option, that no amount of shared history or financial complication was worth accepting abuse. But my heart was still catching up, still processing the fact that the life I'd planned was over, that the future I'd imagined no longer existed. "Will you come tomorrow?" I asked. I know it's a lot to ask, but I could use a friend right now. "I'll be there first thing in the morning," Angela promised. "We'll figure this out together. Okay? You're not alone in this." After we hung up, I felt marginally better, like maybe I wasn't completely adrift after all. I had Angela, and I had my own resources, and I had a brain that had successfully navigated the business world for years. Maybe Michael was wrong. Maybe I could figure out how to live without him. I walked to the kitchen and got a broom and dustpan to clean up the broken crystal. As I swept up the pieces, I thought about the symbolism of it, about how sometimes things had to be completely shattered before they could be rebuilt into something better. The champagne flute had been beautiful, but it had also been fragile, easily broken by a moment of violence. I didn't want to be a champagne flute anymore. I wanted to be something stronger, something that couldn't be shattered by one man's cruelty or indifference. As I disposed of the crystal shards and mopped up the champagne, I started making mental lists of everything I needed to do. Call a divorce attorney. Change the locks on the penthouse. Review all of my financial accounts and make sure Michael couldn't access them. Contact the board of my company and make sure he couldn't make any decisions without my approval. The lists were overwhelming, but they were also empowering. Each task was something concrete I could accomplish, a step toward reclaiming control of my life. I wasn't helpless, despite what Michael wanted me to believe. I was wealthy, educated, and surrounded by resources. I just needed to remember how to use them. By the time I finished cleaning, it was almost 1 in the morning. I should have been exhausted, but I felt strangely energized, like I was finally waking up after years of sleepwalking through my life. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on the couch, looking around the penthouse with new eyes. This was my home, my sanctuary, my space to fill however I wanted, without worrying about what Michael would think or whether it fit his image of how we should live. I could redecorate if I wanted to, or travel wherever I pleased, or invite friends over, without checking his schedule first. The thought was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Freedom, I was learning, was not just about the absence of restriction. It was about the presence of possibility, about the chance to discover who you were when no one else was defining you. I raised my wine glass in a solitary toast, looking out at the city lights that twinkled like stars fallen to earth. Until death do us part, I said aloud, echoing the vows Michael had quoted earlier in the evening. Well, Michael, I guess something did die tonight after all. But it wasn't our marriage that had died. It was the version of myself that had been willing to accept less than I deserved, that had been content to live in the shadow of someone else's dreams and ambitions. That woman was gone now, and I was curious to meet the woman who would take her place. I woke up the next morning to sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my bedroom, and for a brief, disorienting moment, I forgot everything that had happened. The bed felt too big, too empty. And then it all came rushing back. Michael was gone. Our marriage was over. My cheek still bore a faint tenderness where his hand had connected. A physical reminder that last night hadn't been some terrible dream. I reached for my phone on the nightstand and saw 17 missed calls from Michael, along with a string of text messages that started apologetic and grew increasingly desperate as the night wore on. The final message, sent at 4:30 in the morning, simply read, "We need to This is insane, Sarah. You're destroying our life over nothing." Over nothing. He still didn't understand that everything had changed, that the woman who might have accepted his apologies and excuses was gone. I deleted all his messages without reading them fully and blocked his number. Whatever Michael had to say to me from now on could go through lawyers. Angela arrived at 9 sharp, armed with coffee from my favorite cafe, and a determined expression that reminded me why we'd been friends for over 20 years. She took one look at me, and immediately wrapped me in a hug that smelled like her familiar lavender perfume and safety. "How are you holding up?" she asked, pulling back to study my face with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent years as a social worker, helping women escape abusive relationships. "I'm angry," I said, surprising myself with the honesty of it. "I'm not sad or heartbroken, or even scared anymore. I'm just furious that I wasted 20 years of my life on someone who could treat me like that." Angela nodded approvingly. "Good. Anger is useful. Anger gets things done. Sadness can come later if it needs to. But right now, anger is exactly what you need." We sat at my kitchen island with our coffee, and I told her everything I hadn't been able to say over the phone, about the months of suspicion, the credit card statements, the way Michael had gradually isolated me from my friends and taken control of my finance, about how small I'd felt in my own life, how invisible I'd become even to myself. "Sarah," Angela said carefully when I finished, "I need to ask you something. And I want you to really think about your answer. Last night when Michael hit you, was that truly the first, or was it the first time he left a mark?" I opened my mouth to insist it was the first time, then stopped. Was it really? I thought about the times he'd grabbed my arm too tightly during arguments, the way he'd squeeze my shoulder just a little too hard when he wanted me to stop talking at dinner parties, the night 6 months ago when he'd pushed me against the wall during a fight about money, claiming I'd lost my balance. "I don't know," I admitted finally. "There were other times, but they were different, smaller. I made excuses for them." "That's how it starts," Angela said gently. "It escalates gradually, so gradually, that you don't notice you're being conditioned to accept more and more. The fact that he felt comfortable enough to slap you in the face tells me this has been building for a while." The thought made me nauseous. How long had I been living with an abuser without recognizing it? How many red flags had I ignored or rationalized away? "What do I do now?" I asked. "I know I need a lawyer. But Michael knows every divorce attorney in the city. Half of them probably owe him favors." Angela smiled, and there was something almost predatory in the expression. "Lucky for you. I know some lawyers he doesn't. Remember my sister Kate? She moved to Chicago 5 years ago and started her own practice specializing in high-asset divorce cases. She's handled several cases involving powerful men who thought their wives would never leave them." Kate Morrison Chen. I remembered her vaguely from Angela's wedding 15 years ago. a sharp-eyed woman with a reputation for being absolutely ruthless in court. If she was anything like her sister, she wouldn't be intimidated by Michael's connections or his attempts at manipulation. "Can you call her?" I asked. "Already did, on my way over here," Angela said. "She's cleared her afternoon schedule to meet with you. But Sarah, before we go anywhere, we need to talk about something important. Your safety." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "Michael's gone. He's not violent." "Not really. Last night was assault," Angela interrupted firmly. "And men who hit their wives once often hit them again, especially when they're facing financial ruin in a divorce. You said yourself that almost everything you own is in your name. Michael stands to lose a lifestyle he's been living for 17 years. That makes him dangerous." The word dangerous felt foreign when applied to Michael. He was many things: arrogant, manipulative, unfaithful, but dangerous. He was a corporate lawyer who wore tailored suits and worried about his golf handicap. But then I remembered the look in his eyes last night, the cold calculation, the way he'd tried to make me doubt my own perceptions. "What are you suggesting?" I asked. "Security," Angela said without hesitation, "at least temporarily. And we need to document everything from last night. Take photos of any marks. Write down exactly what happened while it's still fresh in your memory. If this gets ugly, and it probably will, you'll need evidence." The idea of photographing my own injuries felt surreal, like I was starring in someone else's tragedy. But Angela was right. I needed to start thinking strategically, to stop hoping this could be resolved amicably, and start preparing for war. I spent the next hour writing down every detail I could remember from the previous evening, from the moment I'd found the credit card statement to the sound of the elevator doors closing behind Michael. Angela helped me take photos of the faint bruising on my cheek, the evidence barely visible but definitely there when you knew what to look for. "Now," Angela said when we finished, "we need to talk about your finances. You said Michael has power of attorney over your account." I nodded, feeling sick all over again. He convinced me it was necessary for tax purposes, and to protect me if anything happened to the business. I trusted him completely. "Okay, that's not insurmountable, but we need to move fast. Can you revoke his power of attorney?" "I think so, but I'm not sure how. Michael always handled all the legal paperwork." Angela pulled out her phone and started typing. "Kate will know. But in the meantime, we should probably visit your bank and make sure Michael can't access your personal accounts or make any major transactions without your direct approval." The thought of Michael potentially draining our accounts or liquidating assets out of spite made my stomach churn. How had I been so naive? How had I signed away control of my own inheritance to someone who could betray me so completely? By noon we were sitting in the conference room at First National Bank, where I'd held my primary accounts for the past 15 years. My personal banker David Chen was a soft-spoken man in his 50s, who had always treated me with the kind of deferential respect reserved for the bank's wealthiest clients. Today, however, he looked distinctly uncomfortable as he reviewed the documents I'd brought. "Miss Davis," he said carefully, "I can certainly add additional security measures to your accounts, but your husband does have legal power of attorney. Revoking that will require specific legal documentation." "What about freezing the accounts temporarily?" Angela asked. "Until Miss Davis can get the proper paperwork filed." David shifted in his seat. "That's complicated. Mr. Davis was here yesterday afternoon, actually. He made some significant transfers between accounts, all perfectly legal given his authority, but..." My blood went cold. "What kind of transfers?" David consulted his computer screen, his expression growing more troubled. "He moved approximately $3 million from your primary investment account into a joint account that he has sole access to. He also authorized the liquidation of several stock positions." The room seemed to tilt around me. $3 million. Michael had stolen $3 million from me in less than 24 hours. While I'd been crying and questioning myself and trying to figure out how to rebuild my life, he'd been systematically looting my account. "Can we reverse the transfers?" I asked, though I already knew the answer from David's expression. "Not without a court order," he said apologetically. "I'm truly sorry, Mrs. Davis. If I'd known there was a dispute, I would have called you first, but Miss Davis has been managing your accounts for years, and the transactions appeared routine. Routine. Michael stealing my inheritance was routine. The casual efficiency of it took my breath away. While I'd been feeling guilty about throwing him out, he'd been planning his exit strategy, making sure he'd have enough money to maintain his lifestyle even after our divorce. What else can he access? Angela asked, taking charge when she saw I was too stunned to speak. David scrolled through more screens, the joint checking accounts, obviously, some of the investment portfolios, but the trust fund your grandfather established is protected. That requires your signature alone, and the business accounts for Harrison Textiles are separate, managed through a different bank. At least there was that. Michael might have stolen $3 million, but he couldn't touch the core of my inheritance or my company. Still, $3 million was a significant chunk of my liquid assets, money I'd planned to use for investments and renovations, and the dozen other projects I'd been considering. We need to freeze everything else immediately, I said, finding my voice again. Every account he has access to, every investment he can liquidate. I don't care what paperwork I need to file or what legal hoops I have to jump through. David nodded quickly. I'll start the process immediately. And Miss Davis, I want you to know that the bank will cooperate fully with any legal proceedings. What Mr. Davis did may have been technically legal, but it was certainly unethical. By the time we left the bank, I felt like I'd been hit by a truck. Michael's betrayal kept revealing new layers, each one more devastating than the last. It wasn't enough that he'd been cheating on me and lying to me for months. It wasn't enough that he'd hit me when I confronted him. He'd also been planning to rob me blind, probably since the moment Rebecca entered his life. I need to see Kate now, I told Angela as we sat in my car in the bank's parking garage. I can't wait until this afternoon. Every hour I delay, Michael is probably stealing more of my money or destroying more evidence or planning his next move. Angela was already dialing her sister's number. Kate, it's Angela. We need to see you now. Sarah's husband just stole $3 million, and we think he's planning to take more. Kate Morrison Chan's law office was in a gleaming downtown high-rise, decorated in shades of gray and black that managed to be both elegant and intimidating. Kate herself was a small woman with steel gray hair and the kind of intense focus that made you understand why she was so successful. She listened to my story without interruption, taking notes on a legal pad with swift, precise strokes. How long has your husband had power of attorney? She asked when I finished. 15 years, I admitted, since right after my grandfather died. Kate's eyebrows rose slightly. 15 years. And in all that time, you never reviewed the terms or considered revoking it. Michael always said it was necessary, I said, feeling foolish. For tax purposes, for business decisions. He made it sound like revoking it would create legal problems for me. Classic financial abuse, Kate said matter-of-factly. He's been positioning himself to control your assets for over a decade. The affair with his secretary was probably just the catalyst that made him decide to cash out. The clinical way she described my marriage was both painful and oddly comforting. At least I wasn't the first woman to find herself in this situation, which meant Kate knew how to fight back. What are my options? I asked. Kate set down her pen and looked at me directly. First, we file for emergency injunctions to freeze all marital assets and revoke Michael's power of attorney. That should prevent him from stealing any more of your money. Second, we file for divorce with allegations of adultery, financial abuse, and domestic violence. Third, we demand the immediate return of the $3 million he stole. Can we get the money back? Probably, but it'll take time, months, maybe longer if he fights it. In the meantime, we need to make sure you have enough liquid assets to live on and to pay for this legal battle. I thought about my remaining accounts, the trust fund Michael couldn't touch, the business that generated steady income. I'd be fine financially, but the principle of the thing made me furious. Michael was essentially holding my own money hostage, betting that I'd be willing to settle for less rather than endure a prolonged court battle. I want to fight, I said firmly. I want every penny back, and I want him to pay for what he's done. Kate smiled, and for the first time, the expression reached her eyes. Good. Because men like your husband are counting on their wives being too intimidated or too tired to fight back. They think they can steal and cheat and abuse their way out of marriages with minimal consequences. I enjoy proving them wrong. We spent the next 3 hours going through every document I could remember signing, every financial decision Michael had made on my behalf, every instance of controlling behavior I could recall. Kate's assistant took detailed notes and prepared a timeline that painted a clear picture of financial abuse spanning nearly 2 decades. One more thing, Kate said as we prepared to leave. Angela mentioned security concerns. I agree that you should take precaution. Men facing significant financial losses in divorce proceedings sometimes escalate to violence or harassment. Do you have somewhere safe you can stay while we get the legal protections in place? I thought about the penthouse, my sanctuary that suddenly felt exposed and vulnerable. Michael knew the building's security systems, knew my routines, knew exactly where to find me. The idea of hiding from my own husband felt like admitting defeat, but I also couldn't ignore the possibility that he might become desperate enough to do something dangerous. I have the house in Aspen, I said slowly. Michael hates Colorado, says the altitude gives him headaches. He'd never think to look for me there. Perfect, Kate said. I suggest you leave tonight. Don't tell anyone, except Angela, where you're going, and don't use credit cards or your phone once you get there. We'll handle the legal filings from here, and I'll call you when it's safe to come back. Leaving Chicago felt like running away, but Angela convinced me it was strategic rather than cowardly. You're not fleeing, she said as she helped me pack a suitcase. You're regrouping. There's a difference. I took only the essentials: clothes, important documents, my laptop, and a few pieces of jewelry that had belonged to my grandmother. Everything else could wait. The penthouse would still be there when this was over, and if Michael tried to enter it without permission, building security had instructions to call the police. As I loaded my car in the underground garage, I felt a strange mixture of fear and excitement. I was scared of what Michael might do when he realized I was fighting back. Scared of the legal battle ahead. Scared of starting over at 45 years old. But I was also excited about the possibility of reclaiming my life, of making my own decisions without worrying about Michael's approval or disapproval. The drive to Aspen took 12 hours, and I used the time to think about everything that had led me to this moment. When had I stopped being Sarah Harrison, the confident young woman who'd built a successful career and inherited a textile empire? When had I become Sarah Davis, the accommodating wife who deferred to her husband's judgment in all things? I thought about my grandfather, who'd built Harrison Textiles from nothing and turned it into one of the most successful companies in the Midwest. He'd been a tough old man who'd never suffered fools gladly, and he'd raised me to be independent and strong-willed. What would he think of the woman I'd become? The woman who'd signed away her power and let a man control her inheritance. But I also thought about the woman I could become now, the woman who was finally done accepting less than she deserved. Michael had made a critical error in underestimating me. He'd assumed I was too weak or too dependent to fight back, that I'd be grateful for whatever scraps he was willing to throw me in a settlement. He was about to learn just how wrong he was. By the time I reached Aspen, it was nearly midnight. The house seat on 5 acres of pristine Colorado wilderness, a modern architectural marvel that seemed to grow out of the mountainside itself. I'd bought it 7 years ago as a retreat, a place to escape the pressures of Chicago society and reconnect with nature. Michael had never understood the appeal, preferring luxury hotels with room service and concierge desks. Standing on the deck in the clear mountain air, looking up at stars that were invisible in the city's light pollution, I felt something shift inside me. This was my house, my retreat, my sanctuary. Michael had never belonged here, had never appreciated its beauty or understood why I loved it. In a way, this house represented the part of myself I'd never given him access to, the part that remained purely mine. I called Angela to let her know I'd arrived safely, then turned off my phone as Kate had instructed. For the next few days I would be completely disconnected from the outside world, free to think and plan and prepare for the battle ahead. Inside, the house was exactly as I'd left it 6 months ago. The cleaning service had maintained it perfectly, the refrigerator was stocked with non-perishables, and the wine cellar held enough vintage bottles to last for months. I could stay here indefinitely if necessary, completely self-sufficient and hidden from Michael's reach. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat by the massive stone fireplace, building a fire more for comfort than warmth. The familiar ritual of stacking kindling and lighting paper helped calm my racing thoughts and center my emotions. Tomorrow, Kate would begin filing the legal paperwork that would formally end my marriage and start the process of reclaiming my stolen money. Michael would probably be served with divorce papers while he was at work in front of his colleagues and clients. The humiliation would be devastating for someone who cared so much about his professional image. Part of me felt guilty about the public embarrassment he would face, but a larger part of me felt deeply satisfied. For 20 years I'd protected Michael's reputation at the expense of my own happiness. I'd smiled at dinner parties while he flirted with other women, stayed silent when he made condescending comments about my intelligence, accepted his excuses when he missed important events, because work was always more important than our relationship. No more. If Michael's reputation suffered because of his own choices, that was his problem to deal with. I was done managing other people's opinions of my husband at the expense of my own self-respect. The fire crackled and popped as I sat there planning my new life. I thought about the changes I wanted to make to Harrison Textiles, the innovations I'd been suggesting for years that Michael had dismissed as too risky or unnecessary. I thought about the charities I wanted to support, the travels I wanted to take, the friendships I wanted to rebuild. For the first time in years I felt hopeful about the future. It wouldn't be easy, and there would undoubtedly be setbacks and challenges I couldn't yet imagine. But I was finally free to make my own choices, to live according to my own values, rather than constantly adapting to someone else's expectations. I raised my wine glass in a solitary toast to the woman I'd been and the woman I was becoming. Here's to new beginnings, I said aloud, my voice echoing in the quiet house, and to never settling for less than I deserve again. Outside, the wind rustled through the pine trees, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called into the darkness. I was alone in the mountains, hundreds of miles from everything familiar, with nothing but an uncertain future ahead of me, and for the first time in 20 years I felt completely free. 3 days of mountain silence had given me clarity I hadn't possessed in years. I woke each morning to pristine air and the distant sound of a creek rushing over stones, spent my days hiking trails that challenged my body while my mind processed decades of manipulation and control. The woman who had fled Chicago in fear was slowly transforming into someone I barely recognized, but deeply respected. On Thursday morning my encrypted phone rang with Kate's number. I answered immediately, hungry for news of the legal storm I'd unleashed. "Sarah, we need to talk," Kate said without preamble. Michael's response was faster and more aggressive than I anticipated. "He's hired Thornton Marsh and Associates." I knew the name immediately. The most expensive, most ruthless divorce firm in Chicago. The kind of lawyers who specialized in destroying reputations and burying opponents in paperwork. They represented celebrities, politicians, and billionaires who needed problems to disappear quietly. "How bad is it?" I asked, settling into the leather chair by my window that overlooked the valley. "He's claiming you're mentally unstable," Kate said bluntly. "Filed emergency motions alleging that you've had a complete psychological breakdown, that you're a danger to yourself and others, and that he needs to maintain control of the finances to protect both of you from your impulsive decisions." The audacity of it took my breath away. Michael was actually trying to paint me as crazy, the oldest trick in the abuser's playbook. Discredit the victim, make everyone question her version of events, turn her own emotions against her. "He can't possibly make that stick," I said, though uncertainty crept into my voice. "I've never had any mental health issues. Never been hospitalized, never even seen a therapist." "That's exactly what he's counting on," Kate replied grimly. "He's arguing that your sudden departure from Chicago, your paranoid accusations about financial impropriety, and your violent reaction to normal marital discord all indicate a recent psychological break. He's requesting immediate psychiatric evaluation and suggesting you're not competent to make financial decisions." I felt sick. This was Michael at his most calculating, using his legal training to weaponize the very trauma he'd caused. By hitting me and stealing from me, he'd created the exact kind of distressed behavior he could now point to as evidence of instability. "What about the money he took?" I asked. He claims it was a routine portfolio rebalancing that you would have approved if you'd been thinking clearly. Says he moved the funds to protect them from your erratic spending patterns, and that he's prepared to return everything once you receive proper medical treatment. The sophistication of his strategy was terrifying. Michael had turned my legitimate anger into evidence of mental illness, my protective retreat into proof of instability, my financial awareness into paranoid delusion. He was using my own reactions to his abuse as weapons against me. Kate, you have to understand something, I said, my voice steady despite the rage building inside me. I am not crazy. I am not unstable. I am a woman who finally woke up to 20 years of manipulation and abuse, and my husband is now trying to gaslight an entire court system to maintain control over me. I believe you completely, Kate said immediately, and we're going to prove. But Sarah, this is going to get very ugly very quickly. Michael is playing for keeps. He's not just trying to win the divorce, he's trying to destroy your credibility so thoroughly that you'll never recover from it. I stared out at the mountains, their peaks sharp and unforgiving against the morning sky. Michael thought he could break me with legal maneuvering and psychological warfare. He thought the woman who'd accepted his control for 20 years would crumble under the pressure of his attack. He had no idea who he was really fighting. What do we need to do? I asked. First, we need to get you back to Chicago for a full psychiatric evaluation by an independent doctor. We'll prove you're completely competent, and that Michael's claims are baseless. Second, we need to start gathering evidence of his long-term financial control and emotional abuse. Third, we need to prepare for the possibility that this is going to become a very public battle. The thought of returning to Chicago, of facing Michael and his lawyers and the inevitable media attention, filled me with dread. But hiding in the mountains wouldn't solve anything. If I wanted my life back, I'd have to fight for it in the arena Michael had chosen. I'll be on a plane tonight, I said. Sarah, there's something else, Kate said carefully. Michael's been telling people you've disappeared. He's filed a missing person report, claiming he's worried about your safety and mental state. The police are looking for you. I laughed, a sound that held no humor whatsoever. Of course he has. He can't just divorce me quietly. He has to make me look like a runaway lunatic first. The good news is that we can use this against him. A man genuinely concerned about his wife's well-being doesn't simultaneously drain her bank accounts and hire attack lawyers. The contradiction in his actions will be obvious to anyone paying attention. After we hung up, I sat in the silence of my mountain refuge for the last time, absorbing the magnitude of what I was walking into. Michael wasn't just trying to win our divorce. He was trying to systematically destroy my reputation, my credibility, and my financial independence. This wasn't a legal proceeding, it was psychological warfare. But I'd learned something important during my days in the wilderness. I'd remembered who I was before Michael, before 20 years of gradual erosion had worn away my confidence and independence. I'd remembered the woman who'd built a career from nothing, who'd inherited a business empire and successfully managed it despite having no formal training. I'd remembered that I was stronger than I'd allowed myself to believe. The flight back to Chicago felt like preparing for battle. I spent the 3 hours reviewing every document Kate had sent me, memorizing the timeline of Michael's financial abuse, preparing for the interrogation I knew was coming. By the time we landed at O'Hare, I felt armored in facts and fury. Angela met me at the airport, her face grim but determined. Kate's arranged for you to stay at the Four Seasons until this blows over, she said as we walked toward the exit. Your penthouse is being watched by reporters, and Michael's been giving interviews about his missing wife to anyone who'll listen. What kind of interview? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. The kind where he plays the concerned husband whose successful wife had a sudden breakdown and vanished without a trace. He's good at it, Sarah. Very convincing. Very sympathetic. If I didn't know the truth, I'd probably feel sorry for him. We drove through downtown Chicago in Angela's car, and I felt like I was seeing my city through new eyes. This was the place where I'd built my life, where I'd thought I'd found love and security. Now it felt like enemy territory, full of people who'd heard Michael's version of events and formed opinions about my mental state, based on his carefully crafted lie. The hotel suite Angela had booked was elegant and anonymous, a neutral space where I could regroup without the emotional weight of familiar surroundings. As soon as we arrived, Kate appeared with a thick folder of documents and an expression that suggested she'd been working around the clock. "The psychiatric evaluation is scheduled for tomorrow morning," she said without preamble. Dr. Elizabeth Warner, one of the most respected forensic psychiatrists in the city. Michael's team tried to block her appointment, arguing for their own doctor, but the judge insisted on an independent evaluation. "What should I expect?" I asked. 3 to 4 hours of comprehensive testing, cognitive assessments, personality evaluations, clinical interview. Warner will be looking for any signs of mental illness, substance abuse, or psychological instability. She'll also assess your competency to make financial and legal decisions. Kate handed me a thick packet of information. "I need you to study this tonight. Background on Warner, typical questions she asks, strategies for presenting yourself in the best possible light, without appearing coached or artificial." I flipped through the pages, absorbing information about psychological testing protocols and proper interview technique. It felt surreal to be preparing for an examination that would determine whether I was competent to control my own life. "What about Michael?" I asked. "Is he submitting to the same evaluation?" Kate's smile was sharp. "Actually, yes," I insisted on reciprocal testing. "If Michael wants to question your mental state, he needs to submit to the same scrutiny. Dr. Warner will evaluate both of you and compare the results." The thought of Michael being forced to undergo psychological testing gave me a grim satisfaction. Let him try to charm his way through a clinical assessment of his narcissistic tendencies and manipulative behavior patterns. "There's more," Kate continued. "I've hired a private investigation firm to document Michael's affair and conduct a full financial audit of your account. We're building a comprehensive case that will show the court exactly who's been behaving irrationally in this marriage." She spread out a series of photographs on the coffee table, and my stomach lurched as I saw Michael and Rebecca together. They were clearly intimate, holding hands as they walked into restaurants, kissing in the parking garage of his office building, entering and leaving hotels together. The images were professionally shot and left no room for doubt about the nature of their relationship. "How long have they been watching him?" I asked. "Since Tuesday. The private investigator I hired specializes in domestic cases, and she's very good at documenting behavior patterns. Look at this." Kate pointed to a time-stamped photo of Michael and Rebecca entering the same hotel where I'd seen the charges on our credit card statement. "This was taken yesterday afternoon, while his lawyers were filing motions claiming he's a devoted husband, worried about his unstable wife. He was having a romantic rendezvous with his secretary." The evidence was damning, but I felt detached from it, as if I was looking at photographs of strangers rather than my husband of 20 years. The man in these pictures looked happy, relaxed, completely untroubled by the psychological distress he claimed I was experiencing. "We'll present all of this to the court," Kate said, "along with the financial records showing his systematic theft and the timeline of his controlling behavior. By the time we're done, Michael's credibility will be in shambles." That evening, alone in my hotel suite, I prepared for the psychiatric evaluation that would determine the course of my future. I practiced answering potential questions about my mental health, my decision-making process, my emotional state. I reviewed my own history, looking for any moments that Michael's lawyers might try to twist into evidence of instability. The irony wasn't lost on me, that I was having to prove my sanity to a court system because I'd finally found the courage to leave an abusive marriage. This was exactly the kind of victim blaming that kept women trapped in dangerous relationships, the fear that their abusers would use the legal system against them if they tried to escape. But I wasn't the same woman who'd been terrorized into submission 20 years ago. I'd spent 3 days in the mountains remembering who I was, and I wasn't going to let Michael's legal games destroy the progress I'd made. The next morning, I arrived at Dr. Warner's office dressed in conservative business attire, projecting competence and stability. The doctor herself was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and kind but penetrating eyes that seemed to see straight through any pretense. "Mrs. Davis," she said, gesturing for me to sit in a comfortable chair across from her desk. "I understand you're here for a court-ordered competency evaluation. Before we begin, I want you to know that everything we discuss will be included in my report to the court. Do you understand and consent to this evaluation? I do, I said clearly. I welcome the opportunity to demonstrate my mental competency and to refute the false allegations my husband has made. Dr. Warner raised an eyebrow slightly. That's an interesting way to frame this situation. Tell me, in your own words, why you think your husband has requested this evaluation. I took a deep breath and began to tell my story, starting with the discovery of Michael's affair and ending with his theft of my money and his current legal strategy. Dr. Warner listened without interruption, taking notes, but maintaining eye contact throughout my narrative. You describe a pattern of behavior that sounds like psychological and financial abuse, she said when I finished. How long have you been aware of these dynamics in your marriage? That's complicated, I admit. Looking back, I can see signs that existed for years, but I didn't recognize them as abuse at the time. I thought I was just being a supportive wife, accommodating my husband's needs and preferences. It wasn't until he hit me that I realized how far things had deteriorated. Tell me about the moment you decided to leave. I described that night in detail, the confrontation, the slap, the casual way Michael had admitted to his affair. Dr. Warner's expression remained neutral, but I could see her processing every word. And your decision to go to Colorado. Your husband's lawyers characterize this as evidence of a psychological break, an impulsive flight from reality. It was strategic, I said firmly. My friend, who's a social worker with experience in domestic violence cases, advised me to prioritize my safety while my lawyer filed for legal protections. I chose Colorado because it's a property my husband dislikes and would be unlikely to follow me to. Dr. Warner nodded thoughtfully. That sounds like rational decision-making to me. Tell me about your business experience. I understand you own a textile company. For the next hour we discussed Harrison Textiles in detail. I explained the company's history, my role in its management, the decisions I'd made that had increased its profitability over the years. Dr. Warner asked detailed questions about financial planning, strategic thinking, and problem-solving skills, all areas where I felt completely confident. Your husband's petition suggests you're not competent to make financial decisions, she said, yet you've successfully managed a multi-million-dollar company for nearly 2 decades. How do you reconcile this contradiction? I can't reconcile it because it's not based in reality, I said. Michael's allegations are a legal strategy designed to maintain his control over my inheritance. He's counting on the court not looking too closely at my actual track record of financial competence. The testing portion of the evaluation was exhaustive. Cognitive assessments that measured my memory, reasoning ability, and decision-making skills. Personality inventories that probed for signs of mental illness or psychological instability. Clinical interviews that explored my emotional state, my relationships, my coping mechanism. Through it all, I felt calm and focused. This was my chance to prove that I was exactly who I'd always been, a competent, rational woman who'd finally found the courage to leave an abusive marriage. One final question, Dr. Warner said, as our session concluded. If the court grants you full control of your finances and dissolves your husband's power of attorney, what are your plans? First, I want to recover the money he stole and ensure he can't access any more of my accounts, I said. Then I want to focus on Harrison Textiles and some expansion projects I've been planning. I also want to establish a foundation to help women leaving abusive marriages, particularly those facing financial manipulation. Dr. Warner made a final note and set down her pen. Miss Davis, I'll have my report completed within 48 hours. I will say that based on our extensive evaluation today, I see no evidence whatsoever of mental illness, psychological instability, or financial incompetence. Your responses have been thoughtful, coherent, and completely appropriate to your situation. Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by anger that I'd been forced to undergo this humiliating process in the first place. But I'd passed Michael's test with flying colors, and now it was his turn to face Dr. Warner's scrutiny. I was leaving the building when my phone rang with an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. Sarah, it's Michael. The sound of his voice made my skin crawl,
but I forced myself to stay calm. You're not supposed to contact me directly. All communication needs to go through our lawyers. Please, just listen for 1 minute, he said, and I could hear the desperation beneath his practiced charm. This has gotten completely out of hand. We can still fix this. Come home, and we'll work everything out privately. No lawyers, no courts, no media attention. Fix what, exactly? I asked coldly. The fact that you stole my money, the fact that you hit me, the fact that you've been cheating on me for months. I made mistakes, he said quickly. I know that, but these lawyers are going to destroy both of us. Do you really want our private business splashed across every newspaper in Chicago? Do you want Rebecca's family to read about her affair with a married man? Do you want your company's reputation damaged by scandal? There it was, the manipulation I'd fallen for so many times before. Michael trying to make me responsible for the consequences of his own actions, trying to convince me that protecting his reputation was more important than my own safety and financial security. Michael, I said quietly, the only person who's going to be destroyed by this process is you, because, unlike you, I have nothing to hide. You're making a huge mistake, Sarah. His voice turned cold, the mask slipping to reveal the calculation underneath. You think you're strong enough to handle this kind of fight, but you have no idea what you're up against. I will bury you in court. I will drag out these proceedings until you've spent every penny of your inheritance on legal fees. I will make sure you never recover from this. Are you threatening me, Michael? I asked, pleased that my voice remained steady. I'm promising you, he said. Back down now, or I will destroy you. He hung up before I could respond, but I wasn't shaken by his threats. If anything, I felt energized by them. Michael had just revealed his true strategy, and more importantly, he'd revealed his fear.
He was terrified of what would happen when all the evidence against him was presented in court. That afternoon, Kate called with an update that made me smile for the first time in days. Michael's psychiatric evaluation didn't go well, she said with satisfaction. Doc Warner spent 4 hours with him, and according to my sources, he became increasingly agitated as the session progressed. Apparently, he didn't appreciate being asked about his controlling behavior and financial manipulation. What happens now? I asked. Now we wait for Doc Warner's report and prepare for the real battle. Michael's team is going to come after you with everything they have, but we're ready for them. The evidence we've gathered is overwhelming, and his credibility is already in question. That evening, I had dinner with Angela at a quiet restaurant away from downtown, where we were less likely to be recognized by reporters or Michael's allies. She'd been my constant support through this nightmare, and I owed her more than I could ever express. How are you holding up? She asked, as we shared a bottle of wine and caught up on everything that had happened. Better than I expected, I said honestly. A month ago, if someone had told me I'd be fighting Michael in court for control of my own life, I would have said they were crazy. But now that I'm in the middle of it, I feel like this is exactly where I need to be. You're different, Angela observed. Stronger, more like the woman you were in college, before Michael slowly convinced you to doubt yourself. She was right. The woman sitting in this restaurant bore little resemblance to the fearful, accommodating wife who'd picked up broken crystal just a week ago. That woman had been terrified of confrontation, desperate to avoid conflict, willing to accept almost anything to maintain peace. This woman was ready for war. Angela, I said, leaning forward across the table, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. Do you think I have a chance of winning this fight? My friend looked at me seriously, considering her answer carefully. Sarah, a week ago I would have been worried. Michael is smart, well-connected, and completely ruthless. He has resources and experience that most people don't. But the woman I'm looking at right now, the woman who's been planning strategy instead of crying, who's gathering evidence instead of making excuses, who's facing down psychological evaluations and legal threats without backing down. That woman doesn't just have a chance of winning. That woman is going to destroy him. Her confidence in me was both humbling and empowering. For 20 years I'd been told I wasn't smart enough, strong enough, or independent enough to manage my own life. Now, for the first time in decades, someone I trusted was telling me I was not only capable of fighting back, but capable of winning. "There's something else," Angela said, her expression growing more serious. "I've been doing some research into Michael's firm, and I've discovered some interesting information about his financial situation." She pulled out her phone and showed me a series of news articles about Hartman, Davis and Associates. Michael's law firm has been struggling for the past 2 years. They lost several major clients, and there are rumors about cash flow problems. Some sources suggest the firm might be facing bankruptcy within the next year. I stared at the articles, pieces of a puzzle suddenly clicking into place. That's why he's so desperate to control my money, I realized. It's not just about maintaining his lifestyle after our divorce. He needs my assets to save his business. Exactly, Angela said. And if the firm goes under, Michael's professional reputation goes with it. He's not just fighting for money, he's fighting for his entire identity. This revelation changed everything. Michael wasn't just a cheating husband trying to avoid the financial consequences of divorce. He was a desperate man facing professional and personal ruin, which made him infinitely more dangerous but also more vulnerable. "We need to tell Kate about this immediately," I said, already reaching for my phone. "Well, already done," Angela smiled. "She's incorporating it into the financial investigation. Apparently there's evidence that Michael has been using your money to prop up the firm for months, possibly longer." The scope of Michael's betrayal kept expanding, each new revelation more shocking than the last. He hadn't just stolen $3 million on a whim, he'd been systematically looting my accounts to fund his failing business, while lying to me about our financial situation. "How did I not see this?" I asked, feeling stupid for missing such obvious signs. "Because he's very good at what he does," Angela said gently. "Financial abusers are experts at hiding their activities and making their victims feel crazy for questioning them. You weren't stupid, Sarah. You were being manipulated by someone who'd had 20 years to perfect his techniques." We finished dinner and returned to my hotel, where I spent the evening reviewing the new information Angela had uncovered. The picture it painted was devastating for Michael's credibility. He was a man facing bankruptcy who'd been stealing from his wife to save his failing business, while simultaneously conducting an affair and preparing to abandon the marriage he'd been financially bleeding dry. When Dr. Warner's report arrived the next morning, it was everything Kate had hoped for and more. The doctor's assessment was unequivocal. I showed no signs of mental illness, psychological instability, or impaired judgment. My decision to leave my marriage appeared to be a rational response to documented abuse, and my financial competency was beyond question. Michael's evaluation, on the other hand, revealed concerning patterns of narcissistic behavior, emotional manipulation, and an inability to accept responsibility for his actions. Warner noted his agitation when questioned about his treatment of me, and his apparent belief that he was entitled to control my finances regardless of my wishes. "This is exactly what we needed," Kate said when we met to review the report. "Michael's entire legal strategy was based on portraying you as incompetent and unstable. Now we have expert testimony that you're completely competent while he's the one with psychological issues." "What's our next move?" I asked. "We go on the offensive," Kate said with a predatory smile. "We file for the return of your stolen money, we demand dissolution of all his financial authority, and we present evidence of his systematic abuse to the court. By the time we're done, Michael won't just lose control of your assets, he'll be lucky if he doesn't face criminal charges for theft and assault." The thought of Michael facing real consequences for his actions filled me with satisfaction. For 20 years, he'd operated with complete impunity, confident that I would never challenge him or fight back. He'd underestimated my strength, my resources, and my determination to reclaim my life. But most importantly, he'd underestimated the woman I'd always been underneath the accommodating facade I'd maintained for so long. The woman who'd built a business empire, who'd survived the loss of her parents and grandfather, who'd managed millions of dollars in assets while he was stealing from her behind her back. That woman was done hiding, done compromising, done accepting less than she deserved. That woman was ready to show Michael exactly what "until death do us part" really meant when the part of herself that had died was the part that had ever loved or trusted him at all. The courtroom felt like a theater where the most important performance of my life was about to begin. I sat beside Kate at the plaintiff's table, wearing a navy suit that projected authority without arrogance, my hands steady despite the magnitude of what was unfolding. Across the aisle, Michael sat with his team of expensive lawyers, his posture rigid with barely contained fury. He hadn't looked at me once since entering the room, but I could feel his rage radiating across the space between us. Judge Patricia Hoffman presided over the proceedings with the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that made seasoned attorneys nervous. She'd built her reputation handling complex divorce cases, involving significant assets, and her tolerance for legal theatrics was notoriously low. Kate had specifically requested her, knowing that Judge Hoffman would focus on facts rather than manipulation. "We're here today," Judge Hoffman began, "to address the emergency motions filed by both parties regarding financial assets, competency evaluations, and temporary restraining orders. Mr. Blackwood, as the petitioner in the competency hearing, you may proceed." Michael's lead attorney, James Blackwood, was everything I'd expected from the city's most expensive divorce firm, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, with the kind of commanding presence that had intimidated countless opponents over his 30-year career. He stood with practiced confidence, ready to destroy my reputation with surgical precision. "Your Honor," Blackwood began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, "we are here because Miss Davis has exhibited a dangerous pattern of erratic behavior that culminated in her abandoning her marital home and disappearing without a trace. This psychological break has rendered her incapable of making rational financial decisions, putting both parties at risk of significant economic harm." He gestured toward a thick stack of documents on his table. "The evidence will show that Miss Davis has become increasingly paranoid and delusional, making wild accusations against her devoted husband, while engaging in reckless spending and impulsive behavior that threatens the financial stability both parties have worked decades to build." I watched Blackwood perform, admiring his skill even as I despised his tactics. He was painting a picture of a wealthy woman having a midlife crisis, driven to irrational behavior by imagined slights and marital discord. To someone who didn't know the truth, it might even sound plausible. "Miss Davis," Blackwood continued, turning slightly toward Michael, "has been forced to take protective measures to preserve marital assets, while seeking appropriate medical intervention for his wife. Far from the financial manipulation alleged in Miss Davis's filing, these actions represent the desperate attempts of a loving husband to protect his family's legacy." Kate squeezed my hand under the table, a silent reminder to stay calm despite the outrageous lies being presented as fact. We'd prepared for this exact strategy, and I felt ready for whatever Blackwood might throw at me. "Furthermore," Blackwood said, his voice taking on a more dramatic tone, "Miss Davis has refused all attempts at reconciliation, instead choosing to hide in a remote location, while expensive lawyers wage a campaign of character assassination against a man whose only crime was loving his wife enough to seek help for her obvious psychological distress." Judge Hoffman's expression remained neutral, but I caught a slight narrowing of her eyes that suggested she was less impressed with Blackwood's performance than he might have hoped. She'd heard similar arguments countless times before, and her experience would help her distinguish between legitimate concern and calculated manipulation. "Your Honor," Blackwood concluded, "we respectfully request that the court maintain Miss Davis's financial authority pending a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation of Mrs. Davis, and that all asset transfers be frozen until her competency can be properly assessed." Kate rose to respond, and I felt a surge of confidence watching her prepare to dismantle Blackwood's argument piece by piece. She'd spent days preparing for this moment, and her thorough knowledge of our case showed in her composed demeanor. "Your Honor," Kate began, "Miss Blackwood has just presented the court with a masterclass in victim blaming and psychological manipulation. The evidence will show that Miss Davis is not only completely competent, but that she's the victim of a systematic campaign of financial abuse and domestic violence that has been escalating for years. She moved to the evidence table and picked up Dr. Warner's report, the independent psychiatric evaluation, requested by Ms. Davis himself has conclusively determined that Mrs. Davis shows no signs of mental illness, psychological instability, or impaired judgment. Dr. Warner's report specifically notes that Mrs. Davis's decision to leave her marriage appears to be a rational response to documented abuse. Kate paused, letting the weight of that statement settle in the courtroom. In contrast, Mr. Davis's own evaluation revealed concerning patterns of narcissistic behavior, emotional manipulation, and an inability to accept responsibility for his actions. The very man questioning his wife's mental state has been found to have significant psychological issues of his own. I watched Michael's jaw tighten as Kate spoke, his careful composure beginning to crack. He clearly hadn't expected his own evaluation to be used against him so effectively. But this case isn't really about mental health, Kate continued, her voice gaining strength. It's about power, control, and theft. The evidence will show that Miss Davis has stolen over $3 million from his wife's accounts, while conducting an extramarital affair and physically assaulting her when she confronted him about his behavior. Kate lifted a photograph from the evidence table. This image shows Davis entering a hotel with his secretary, Rebecca Martinez, on the same day his lawyers filed motions, claiming he's a devoted husband, concerned about his wife's welfare. While pretending to search for his missing wife, Mr. Davis was actually continuing his affair and planning to steal more of her money. The hypocrisy was so blatant that even Judge Hoffman's carefully neutral expression showed a flicker of disgust. Michael had been caught in the most obvious kind of lie, and his legal team's credibility was already taking damage. Your Honor, Kate said, returning to her position, this is a case about a wealthy woman who finally found the courage to leave an abusive marriage, and an abuser who's using the legal system to continue his campaign of control and intimidation. We ask the court to see through Miss Davis's manipulation and restore Mrs. Davis's rightful control over her own life and assets. Judge Hoffman looked between the two legal teams, her expression thoughtful. I've reviewed the preliminary filings from both parties, and I must say the allegations are quite serious. Miss Blackwood, I'm particularly troubled by the timing of the financial transfers your client made. Can you explain why Mr. Davis felt it necessary to move $3 million immediately after the alleged domestic dispute? Blackwood stood again, but his earlier confidence had dimmed noticeably. Your Honor, those transfers were routine portfolio management decisions that Mrs. Davis would normally have approved. Given her erratic behavior, Mr. Davis felt it prudent to protect those assets until she could receive proper medical attention. Judge Hoffman's eyebrows rose slightly. Mr. Blackwood, I've been handling financial disputes for 15 years. $3 million moved to accounts accessible only by one spouse, immediately following a marital confrontation, does not strike me as routine. I felt a thrill of satisfaction watching Blackwood struggle to explain away Michael's obviously predatory behavior. The judge wasn't buying his story, and her questions were forcing him to confront the weakness of his position. Furthermore, Judge Hoffman continued, I'm concerned about the missing person report filed by Mr. Davis. If he was genuinely worried about his wife's safety, why didn't he contact her family or friends before involving law enforcement? The timeline suggests this report was filed more for public relations purposes than out of genuine concern. Michael's face was growing red with barely suppressed anger. His carefully orchestrated legal strategy was falling apart in real time, and he was helpless to stop. Kate had anticipated every move, prepared for every argument, and armed me with the evidence needed to expose his lies. Your Honor, Kate interjected, we'd like to present testimony from Mrs. Davis herself. She's requested the opportunity to address the court directly about the allegations made against her competency and character. Judge Hoffman nodded. Mrs. Davis, please approach the witness stand. Walking to the front of the courtroom felt like crossing a battlefield, but I held my head high and my shoulders straight. This was my moment to speak my truth. to reclaim my voice after 20 years of being silenced and controlled. I placed my hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Kate began with basic questions about my background, my education, my business experience. I answered clearly and confidently, establishing my credentials as a successful businesswoman who'd managed significant assets for nearly 2 decades. Then she moved to the heart of the matter. Mrs. Davis, can you describe your marriage to the defendant in your own words? I took a breath and began to tell my story, starting with the gradual erosion of my independence and ending with Michael's assault and theft. I spoke about the financial control he'd exerted, the way he'd isolated me from friends and family, the systematic undermining of my confidence and judgment. Most importantly, I spoke about the moment I'd finally seen clearly what my life had become. Miss Davis, Kate asked, do you believe your decision to leave your marriage was rational? Absolutely, I replied without hesitation. Staying with someone who steals from you, lies to you, and hits you isn't rational. It's dangerous. Leaving was the most rational decision I've made in 20 years. How do you respond to allegations that you're mentally unstable? I looked directly at Michael as I answered. I think anyone who examines the evidence objectively will see that I'm not the one with psychological problems in this relationship. I'm a woman who finally woke up to decades of manipulation and abuse, and I refuse to be victimized any longer. Blackwood's cross-examination was aggressive, but ultimately ineffective. He tried to paint my departure to Colorado as evidence of instability, but I calmly explained the safety considerations that had motivated my decision. He questioned my financial management abilities, but I detailed my successful oversight of Harrison Textiles in language that demonstrated complete competency. He attempted to suggest that my accusations against Michael were fabricated, but I had documentation for every claim. Most damaging to Michael's case was Blackwood's attempt to characterize the physical assault as a minor domestic dispute. Mrs. Davis, he said with obvious skepticism, you claim your husband slapped you during an argument. Isn't it possible you're exaggerating this incident to gain advantage in divorce proceedings? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and I met it head-on. Mr. Blackwood, are you seriously suggesting that I should minimize the fact that my husband hit me? That I should accept domestic violence as normal marital discord? That's exactly the kind of thinking that keeps women trapped in abusive relationships. Judge Hoffman's expression grew stern as she watched this exchange. Blackwood had just made a serious tactical error, essentially arguing that spousal abuse wasn't grounds for divorce if it was minor enough. The judge was clearly unimpressed with his line of questioning. When my testimony concluded, Kate called Dr. Warner to present her evaluation finding. The psychiatrist's testimony was devastating to Michael's case, clinically dismantling every allegation of mental illness or incompetence. She described me as remarkably composed and rational given the circumstances, and noted that my responses had been completely appropriate for someone experiencing financial abuse and domestic violence. More damaging was Dr. Warner's testimony about Michael's evaluation. While maintaining professional discretion, she made it clear that he'd shown concerning patterns of manipulative behavior and an inability to accept responsibility for his actions. When asked directly whether she believed I was competent to manage my own affairs, her response was unequivocal. Absolutely. Mrs. Davis demonstrated superior financial understanding and sound judgment throughout our evaluation. The private investigator Kate had hired took the stand next, presenting evidence of Michael's affair with clinical precision. The photographs and timeline left no doubt about the relationship's duration or Michael's deception. Most embarrassing for Michael was the evidence that he'd been with Rebecca on the very day he'd filed his missing person report, claiming to be desperately worried about my whereabouts. In your professional opinion, Kate asked the investigator, does Davis's behavior suggest genuine concern for his wife's welfare? No, the investigator replied bluntly. A man genuinely worried about his missing wife doesn't spend the afternoon in a hotel room with his secretary. The financial analyst Kate had hired delivered equally damaging testimony about the pattern of asset transfers and Michael's access to my account.
The evidence showed systematic manipulation of my finances going back years, with transfers that consistently benefited Michael while depleting my liquid assets. Most shocking was the revelation about Michael's law firm. The analyst had uncovered evidence that Michael had been using my money to cover the firm's operating expenses and outstanding debts, essentially forcing me to unknowingly subsidize his failing business. Can you estimate the total amount Mrs. Davis's accounts have been depleted to support Mr. Davis's business interests? Kate asked. The analyst consulted his notes. Based on our analysis, approximately $8 million has been transferred from Ms. Davis's accounts to cover business expenses, debt payments, and cash flow shortfalls at Hartman Davis and Associates over the past 3 years. A collective gasp went through the courtroom gallery. $8 million. Michael hadn't just stolen $3 million impulsively, he'd been systematically draining my inheritance for years to prop up his failing law practice. I watched Michael's face as this information was presented, and for the first time I saw genuine fear in his eyes. His legal strategy had been based on portraying me as irrational and incompetent, but the evidence was painting him as a thief and a fraud who'd been stealing from his wife to hide his professional failure. When it came time for Michael to testify in his own defense, his performance was a disaster. Blackwood tried to present him as a concerned husband, making difficult decisions to protect his family's assets, but Michael's answers were evasive and unconvincing. Under Kate's cross-examination, he became increasingly agitated and defensive. Mr. Davis, Kate asked, can you explain why you moved $3 million to accounts your wife couldn't access, immediately after admitting to an extramarital affair? Those were routine financial management decisions, Michael replied, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. Routine, Kate repeated. Is it routine for you to make major financial decisions without consulting your wife? Sarah doesn't understand complex financial instruments, Michael said dismissively. I've been managing our investments for years because she lacks the expertise. Kate smiled coldly. Ms. Davis, are you aware that your wife has successfully managed a multi-million-dollar textile company for nearly 2 decades? Michael's jaw worked silently for a moment. That's different. The textile business is simple compared to sophisticated investment strategies. Kate's voice carried a note of incredulity. Mr. Davis, Harrison Textiles has increased its value by over 40% under your wife's management. During that same period, your law firm has been losing money and facing potential bankruptcy. Which of you demonstrates superior financial expertise? The question hit its mark perfectly. Michael's face flushed red, and his carefully maintained composure finally cracked completely. You don't understand what it's like, he snapped, his voice rising. Living with someone who questions every decision, who doesn't trust your judgment, who thinks she knows better than someone with 20 years of legal experience. Sarah needed guidance, needed someone to protect her from her own impulses. Is that why you hit her? Kate asked quietly. To provide guidance? The courtroom fell silent. Michael stared at Kate for a long moment, realizing he'd walked directly into her trap. His angry outburst had revealed exactly the kind of controlling, condescending attitude that had characterized our marriage for years.
That was a moment of frustration, he said weakly. It didn't mean anything. Domestic violence doesn't mean anything. Kate pressed. Mr. Davis, do you believe you have the right to strike your wife when she questions your decisions? No, of course not, Michael said. But the damage was done. His earlier dismissive attitude toward my intelligence and judgment, combined with his minimization of the assault, had painted a clear picture of an abusive husband who believed he was entitled to control his wife through whatever means necessary. Judge Hoffman's expression had grown increasingly stern throughout Michael's testimony. When Kate finished her cross-examination, the judge's questions were sharp and pointed. Miss Davis, she said, you've testified that you moved significant assets to protect them from your wife's allegedly poor judgment. But the evidence shows that your own business is failing while hers is thriving. Can you explain this contradiction? Michael struggled to answer coherently, his earlier confidence completely shattered. The legal market has been challenging, he said finally, but that doesn't mean Sarah is better qualified to make investment decisions. Miss Davis, Judge Hoffman continued, You filed a missing person report, claiming to be worried about your wife's safety. Yet evidence shows you were with another woman during this same period. How do you reconcile these facts? I was conducting business, Michael said weakly, the lie obvious to everyone in the courtroom. Judge Hoffman's patience was clearly exhausted. Mr. Davis, this court has seen extensive evidence of financial manipulation, adultery, domestic violence, and systematic deception. Your credibility has been severely damaged by your own testimony and behavior. Do you have anything else to add before I make my ruling? Michael looked desperately at his legal team, but Blackwood was staring at his notes, clearly recognizing that the case was lost. Michael had destroyed his own credibility through his arrogance and inability to accept responsibility for his actions. Your Honor, Michael said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, I love my wife. Everything I did was to protect our marriage and our future together. Judge Hoffman's expression softened slightly, but her voice remained firm. Mr. Davis, love doesn't involve theft, deception, or violence. The evidence presented today shows a pattern of financial abuse and domestic violence that cannot be excused or minimized. She shuffled through the papers before her, then looked up at both legal teams. After reviewing all testimony and evidence, this court finds that Mrs. Davis is completely competent to manage her own affairs and that Mr. Davis's emergency motions are without merit. Furthermore, the evidence suggests that Mr. Davis has engaged in systematic financial manipulation and domestic abuse. My heart raced as I waited for her complete ruling, knowing that this moment would determine the course of my future. Therefore, Judge Hoffman continued, I hereby order the immediate return of all assets improperly transferred by Mr. Davis, including the $3 million moved after the domestic dispute and any additional funds used to support his business interests without Ms. Davis's knowledge or consent. I also grant Mrs. Davis's request to revoke all powers of attorney previously granted to Mr. Davis. Relief flooded through me, but Judge Hoffman wasn't finished. Additionally, I'm issuing a temporary restraining order prohibiting Mr. Davis from contacting Mrs. Davis, except through legal counsel, and from accessing any accounts or assets in her name. Mr. Davis, you have 48 hours to return all misappropriated funds, or this court will consider criminal referrals for theft and fraud. The gavel came down with finality, and Michael's face went white. In one afternoon he'd lost control of my money, his access to my assets, and quite possibly his freedom if he couldn't return what he'd stolen. As we gathered our materials and prepared to leave, Kate leaned over and whispered, Sarah, you just won everything. Complete financial independence, validation of your competency, and legal protection from further abuse. Michael's credibility is destroyed, and his theft has been exposed. This is total victory. I looked across the courtroom at Michael, who sat slumped in his chair as his expensive lawyers packed their briefcases around him. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the exposure of his lies and manipulation. The powerful attorney who'd controlled my life for 20 years had been reduced to a desperate man, facing financial ruin and potential criminal charges. As I walked out of the courthouse with Kate and Angela flanking me, I felt lighter than I had in years. The legal system had worked exactly as it was supposed to, seeing through Michael's manipulation and recognizing the truth of my situation. I was free not just from my marriage, but from the financial control that had kept me trapped for so long. What happens now? I asked Kate as we stood on the courthouse steps, Chicago spreading out before us in the afternoon sunlight. Now Michael has to return your money and face the consequences of his actions, Kate replied. His law firm is probably finished, his reputation is destroyed, and depending on what our financial investigation uncovers, he may face criminal charges. The thought should have made me feel guilty or sad, but all I felt was a deep sense of justice finally being served. Michael had made his choices, and now he would live with the results. I was done taking responsibility for his feelings, or protecting him from the consequences of his actions. And me? I asked, what's next for me? Kate smiled. Sarah, you're 45 years old, worth tens of millions of dollars, and completely free to live your life however you choose. The world is yours. As we walked toward the parking garage, I thought about all the possibilities that lay ahead. Could travel anywhere, invest in any project, support any cause that mattered to me. For the first time in 20 years, every decision would be mine alone to make. But most importantly, I would never again allow anyone to make me feel small or powerless, or dependent. The woman who'd been picking up broken crystal a week ago was gone forever, replaced by someone who knew exactly what she was worth and refused to accept anything less. Michael had taught me a valuable lesson about what "until death do us part" really meant. Sometimes the part of you that dies isn't your body, but your willingness to be treated as less than you deserve. And sometimes that death is exactly what you need to finally start living. 6 months later, I stood in the renovated boardroom of Harrison Textiles, looking out at the faces of executives who now reported directly to me, instead of through Michael's interference. The morning sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating charts that showed record profits and expansion plans I'd only dreamed of implementing during my marriage. This was my company, my vision, my success, and for the first time in decades, no one could diminish that achievement. Sustainable Cotton Initiative has exceeded all projections. My new CFO, Maria Santos, was saying as she presented the quarterly results. Revenue is up 38% from last year, and our environmental certifications have opened doors to markets we'd never accessed before. I smiled, remembering how Michael had dismissed these exact innovations as frivolous environmental nonsense that would hurt our profit margin. His narrow thinking had held the company back for years, but now we were leading the industry in sustainable practices while dramatically increasing profitability. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. After the court ruling, I'd spent weeks carefully reviewing every aspect of the business, identifying areas where Michael's conservative approach had stifled growth. I'd hired new leadership, implemented technologies he'd resisted, and pursued partnerships he'd deemed too risky. The results spoke for themselves. "There's something else," Maria continued, her expression brightening. "The Harrison Foundation Scholarship Program has received over 2,000 applications. The response from women leaving abusive relationships has been overwhelming. The foundation had been one of my first major initiatives after regaining control of my finances. Using part of the money Michael had stolen and been forced to return, I'd established a comprehensive program to help women escape financial abuse. We provided emergency funding, legal assistance, business training, and housing support. It was the kind of meaningful work I'd always wanted to do but had never been allowed to pursue. After the meeting, I returned to my corner office, which I'd completely redesigned to reflect my own aesthetic rather than the masculine power displays Michael had favored. Soft lighting, natural materials, and artwork by local women artists created an environment that felt both professional and nurturing. This space belonged to me entirely. My assistant knocked and entered with a stack of mail and a knowing smile. "Miss Harrison," she said, deliberately using my maiden name, which I'd legally reclaimed immediately after the divorce was finalized. "There's something here you'll want to see." She handed me a newspaper clipping from the Chicago Tribune's business section. The headline read, "Hartman, Davis and Associates files for bankruptcy. Senior partner faces federal investigation." Below was a photo of Michael looking haggard and defeated as he left a federal courthouse. I read the article with detached interest, noting that the investigation had uncovered additional financial irregularities beyond what had been revealed in our divorce proceeding. Several clients were suing for malpractice, and the Illinois State Bar was conducting its own inquiry into Michael's conduct. His professional license was suspended pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. The article mentioned that Michael was now working as a contract attorney for a small firm, making a fraction of his former salary and facing potential prison time if convicted of the federal charges. His fall from grace had been swift and complete, exactly as Judge Hoffman had predicted. I felt no satisfaction in his suffering, but I also felt no guilt. Michael had created his own destruction through decades of lies, theft, and manipulation. The criminal charges weren't based on vindictive accusations from our divorce, but on objective evidence of financial crimes that had harmed multiple victims. Justice was finally being served. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts, and Angela entered with 2 cups of coffee and her trademark mischievous grin. She'd become my closest advisor during the transition, helping me navigate both the emotional and practical challenges of rebuilding my life. "Reading about your ex-husband's latest legal troubles?" she asked, settling into the chair across from my desk. "Just staying informed," I replied, setting the article aside. "It's important to understand what's happening, but I refuse to let his problems consume my energy." "Good," Angela said approvingly, "because I have much better news to share. The Denver expansion project has been approved by the City Planning Commission. You'll be breaking ground on the new facility next month." The Denver project represented everything I'd wanted to accomplish but had been prevented from pursuing during my marriage. A state-of-the-art manufacturing facility that would create 500 jobs while setting new standards for environmental responsibility and worker safety. Michael had called it an expensive gesture that would bankrupt the company. Instead, it was positioned to become our most profitable division. "There's something else," Angela continued, her expression growing more serious. "I've been talking to Rebecca Martinez." I looked up sharply. Rebecca had disappeared from public view after the affair became headline news, and I'd assumed she'd left Chicago entirely to escape the scandal. "She reached out through a lawyer," Angela explained. "She wants to meet with you. Apparently, she has information about Michael that she thinks you should know." The idea of facing Michael's former mistress held no appeal, but my curiosity was stronger than my reluctance. Rebecca had been intimately involved in Michael's life during the period when he'd been stealing from me and planning his exit strategy. If she had information that could help other victims or provide closure, I was willing to listen. "Set it up," I said, "but somewhere neutral, and I want you there with me." 3 days later, we met Rebecca at a quiet coffee shop in Lincoln Park, far from the downtown legal district where she might be recognized. She looked younger than I'd expected, probably in her mid-20s, with the kind of polished appearance that suggested expensive grooming and careful attention to image, but her eyes held a wariness that spoke of hard-learned lessons about trusting powerful men. "Miss Harrison," she said as I approached, standing respectfully, "thank you for agreeing to see me. I know this must be difficult." I studied her face, looking for signs of the manipulative seductress I'd imagined, but saw only a young woman who appeared genuinely remorseful and more than a little frightened. "You said you had information I should know," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "I'm here to listen." Rebecca glanced around nervously before speaking. "Michael told me you were mentally unstable," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "He said you'd had multiple breakdowns, that you couldn't be trusted with money or important decisions. He made me believe I was helping protect you by keeping him emotionally stable." The sophistication of Michael's manipulation was staggering. He'd convinced his mistress that their affair was actually a form of charity, a sacrifice she was making to protect his mentally ill wife. The lie was so elaborate and self-serving that I almost admired its creativity. "He showed me medical records," Rebecca continued. "Documents that supposedly proved you'd been hospitalized for psychiatric treatment multiple times. I found out later they were forgeries, but at the time I believed everything he told me." "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. Rebecca's composure finally cracked, and tears began streaming down her face. "Because I found out what he really is. After your divorce became public, other women started contacting me, women he'd had affairs with before me, women he'd stolen from, women he'd manipulated and discarded. I realized I wasn't special. I was just another victim in a pattern that went back years." She pulled out her phone and showed me a group chat with nearly a dozen women, all sharing similar stories of Michael's predatory behavior. Young attorneys, paralegals, clients and business associates who'd been seduced, manipulated, and in some cases financially exploited by my ex-husband. "The FBI contacted me last month," Rebecca said, wiping her eyes with a tissue. "They're building a case against Michael for mail fraud, wire fraud and racketeering. Apparently he's been running elaborate schemes for over a decade, using romantic relationships to gain access to women's finances and professional connections." The scope of Michael's criminal behavior was far broader than anything that had emerged during our divorce proceeding. He wasn't just an unfaithful husband who'd stolen from his wife. He was a career criminal who'd been systematically defrauding victims for years. "I'm testifying against him," Rebecca said firmly. "I know I can't undo the damage I helped cause to your marriage, but I can make sure he faces consequences for what he's done to all of us." I looked at this young woman who'd been as much a victim of Michael's manipulation as I had been, just in different ways. Her willingness to come forward despite the personal cost showed a courage I hadn't expected. "Rebecca," I said gently, "I appreciate you telling me this, and I'm glad you're cooperating with the investigation, but you don't need my forgiveness. We were both manipulated by the same man, just through different lies." Relief flooded her features, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she seemed to relax. "There's one more thing," she said. "Michael kept detailed records of all his schemes, financial documents, personal information about his victims, even recordings of private conversations. The FBI seized everything when they raided his apartment, but I thought you should know that your privacy may have been violated in ways you haven't discovered yet." The idea that Michael had been documenting his crimes against me, possibly recording private conversations without my knowledge, made my skin crawl, but it also meant there would be extensive evidence for his prosecution, making conviction much more likely. After Rebecca left, Angela and I sat in silence for several minutes, processing what we'd learned. Michael's betrayal had been even more comprehensive than I'd imagined, but knowing the truth was better than living with uncertainty. "How do you feel?" Angela asked finally. "Vindicated," I said honestly. For months I wondered if I'd overreacted, if maybe Michael's behavior wasn't as bad as I'd thought. Now I know I actually underestimated how dangerous he was. That evening, alone in my penthouse, I poured myself a glass of wine and stood on the balcony overlooking the city. 6 months ago I'd been in this same spot, picking up broken crystal and questioning everything I thought I knew about my life. Now I was a different person entirely, stronger and more confident than I'd ever been. The intercom buzzed, and my doorman announced that I had a visitor. Judge Hoffman was in the lobby asking to see me. I was surprised but curious, and I instructed him to send her up. Judge Hoffman arrived carrying a bottle of champagne and wearing a smile I'd never seen in her courtroom. "I hope you don't mind the unannounced visit," she said. "I have news I wanted to share personally." I invited her in, intrigued by this unprecedented breach of judicial protocol. Judge Hoffman had always maintained strict professional boundaries, so her presence in my home suggested something significant. "Michael Davis pled guilty to 14 federal charges this afternoon," she said without preamble. "Wire fraud, mail fraud, money laundering and racketeering. He's facing 25 to life." The news hit me like a physical blow. I'd known Michael was in legal trouble, but I hadn't expected such a comprehensive prosecution, or such severe potential penalty. "The case you brought exposed a criminal enterprise that had been operating for over a decade," Judge Hoffman continued. "Your courage in fighting back led to the identification of dozens of victims, and the recovery of millions of dollars in stolen assets." She set the champagne on my kitchen counter and turned to face me directly. "Sarah, I've been a judge for 18 years, and I've seen countless cases of domestic and financial abuse. Most victims never fight back because they're too scared, too broke, or too broken to challenge their abuser. You not only fought back, you won completely, and your victory has created justice for victims who never had the resources to seek it themselves." I felt tears building in my eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming validation of finally being recognized for the courage it had taken to reclaim my life. "There's something else," Judge Hoffman said. "The Illinois State Bar has asked me to recommend attorneys for a new task force on financial abuse in domestic relationships. I'd like to recommend you for the civilian oversight position." The offer was unexpected, but deeply meaningful. Using my experience to help other women navigate the legal system and escape financial abuse would give purpose to everything I'd endured. "I'd be honored," I said without hesitation. After Judge Hoffman left, I opened the champagne and raised a glass to the woman I'd become. 6 months ago I'd been a victim hiding in the mountains, afraid of my own shadow and uncertain about my future. Now I was a successful businesswoman, a philanthropist, and an advocate for other women facing similar challenges. My phone rang with a call from Kate, who'd become more than just my lawyer during our fight for justice. She'd become a trusted advisor and genuine friend, someone who understood the complexities of rebuilding a life after surviving abuse. "Sarah, I just heard about Michael's plea deal," she said. "How are you processing it?" "Honestly, I feel relieved," I replied. "For months I've been waiting for the other shoe to drop.
wondering if he'd find some way to escape consequences or come after me again. Now I know he'll be in prison for the rest of his life, and I can finally move forward without looking over my shoulder. You should feel proud, Kate said firmly. Your decision to fight back didn't just save your own life. It saved the lives of women who were still being victimized by Michael's schemes. That takes incredible courage. After we hung up, I walked through my penthouse, seeing it with new eyes. This had been the site of the worst moment of my marriage, the place where Michael had hit me and admitted to his affair. But it had also been the place where I'd made the decision to reclaim my life, where I'd gathered the courage to fight back against years of manipulation and control. I'd considered selling the penthouse after the divorce, thinking I needed a fresh start in a new location, but I'd realized that running away from difficult memories wasn't the answer. Instead, I'd chosen to transform this space into something that reflected my new life, filling it with art and furniture, and personal touches that brought me joy. The broken crystal had been replaced with new pieces, but I'd kept one small shard as a reminder of that pivotal night. It sat in a place of honor on my mantle, a symbol of how something shattered could still catch the light and create beauty. Standing in my living room, surrounded by evidence of the life I'd built for myself, I thought about Michael spending the rest of his days in a federal prison cell. The powerful attorney who'd controlled my life for 20 years had been reduced to a convicted felon who would die behind bars. The transformation was so complete, it seemed almost mythical, but I felt no triumph in his downfall, only a deep sense of closure. Michael had made his choices, and now he would live with the consequences. I was finally free to make my own choices, to live according to my own values, to love and trust and risk on my own terms. The next morning, I had breakfast with Angela at our favorite cafe, a ritual we'd maintained throughout my recovery and transformation. She looked at me across the table with the satisfaction of someone who'd watched a friend evolve into their best self. You know, she said, stirring cream into her coffee, I never told you this, but I was terrified you'd go back to him, even after everything he'd done, even after the court ruled in your favor. I was afraid you'd convince yourself you could fix the marriage. I was afraid of that too, I admitted. For about 5 minutes right after the divorce was finalized, I actually felt guilty about destroying his life. Then I remembered that he'd destroyed his own life through his choices, and I'd simply refused to be destroyed along with him. Angela smiled. That's exactly the difference between the woman you were and the woman you've become. The old Sarah would have spent years blaming herself for Michael's downfall. The new Sarah understands that everyone is responsible for their own actions and consequences. As we finished breakfast and prepared to start another day, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. 6 months ago, I'd been a broken woman fleeing to the mountains to escape an abusive marriage. Now I was a successful entrepreneur, a philanthropist, and an advocate for other women facing similar challenges. The transformation hadn't been easy. There had been dark moments of doubt, nights when I'd questioned whether I was strong enough to rebuild my life from nothing. There had been legal setbacks, financial complications, and emotional challenges that had tested my resolve, but I'd persevered, supported by friends like Angela and Kate, who'd reminded me of my own strength when I'd forgotten it myself. Most importantly, I'd learned to trust my own judgment again. For 20 years, Michael had systematically undermined my confidence, making me doubt my perceptions and defer to his supposed expertise. Breaking free from that psychological control had been harder than any legal battle or financial negotiation, but I'd done it. I'd reclaimed my voice, my power, and my right to live life on my own terms. I'd proven to myself and everyone else that I was capable of not just surviving, but thriving, after leaving an abusive marriage. As I walked back to my office to begin another day of meaningful work, I thought about Michael's favorite toast from our anniversary dinners. Until death do us part, he'd always said, raising his glass with a smile that I'd once found charming, but now recognized as predatory. He'd been right about the death that would end our marriage, but wrong about whose death it would be. The woman who'd accepted his control, who'd made herself small to accommodate his ego, who'd believed his lies about her incompetence and dependence. That woman had died on the night he'd struck me. Her death had been necessary for my rebirth. The woman who'd emerged from those ashes was someone Michael had never known, and could never have controlled. She was fierce where the old Sarah had been accommodating, confident where she'd been doubtful, independent where she'd been dependent. She was exactly who I'd always been meant to be, finally free to live without apology or compromise. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.